She walked right up to him, smelled him, and for a moment, just a moment, everyone watching thought this was it. He was going home, but then she turned around, and the entire herd followed. He called out to them, again and again, but they just kept walking. That baby elephant had just been rejected by his own family. And if you're wondering how that's even possible, how a herd that never leaves anyone behind could just walk away, that's exactly what I spent the last week trying to understand. This story comes from a wildlife conservation team in Kenya. And I have to be honest with you, when I first read their report, I thought I knew how it was going to end. I was wrong. If you're new here, welcome. This channel tells real wildlife stories, not the cute, simple ones. The real ones. The ones that stay with you. So if that sounds like something you want to see more of, take a second, hit subscribe, and let's get into this. Because to understand what happened in that field, we need to go back 5 months. Now, before I get into what happened, you need to understand something about where this story takes place. Kenya, East Africa. Specifically, a region called Amboseli, right at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro. If you've ever seen those iconic photographs of elephants walking across golden plains with a massive snow-capped mountain in the background, that's Amboseli. It's one of the most famous wildlife regions on the planet. Thousands of elephants call this place home. They've roamed these lands for generations, following the same migration paths their ancestors walked hundreds of years ago. It's a place of incredible beauty. But in 2019, that beauty was hiding something terrible underneath the surface, because that year, the rains didn't come. And when the rains don't come in Amboseli, everything changes. You see, most people don't realize how dependent elephants are on water. An adult elephant needs to drink between 40 and 50 gallons of water every single day. That's not optional, that's survival. And it's not just about drinking. Elephants use water to cool down, to bathe, to keep parasites off their skin. Water sources are where herds meet, where they socialize, where young elephants learn from older ones. Take away the water, and you don't just make elephants thirsty. You tear apart the entire fabric of how they live. In 2019, the Amboseli region experienced one of its driest periods in over 3 decades. Rivers that had flowed for as long as anyone could remember turned into cracked, empty beds of dust. Waterholes that once gathered hundreds of animals became patches of dried mud. And the elephants, they knew something was wrong long before the humans did. Here's what most people don't understand about elephant herds. They're not just random groups of animals traveling together. They're families. Tight, organized, deeply bonded families led by a matriarch, usually the oldest female. She's the one who remembers where the water was during the last drought. She's the one who knows which paths are safe and which ones aren't. The survival of the entire herd depends on her memory, her experience, her decisions. And during a drought, those decisions become impossible. Do you stay near a drying waterhole and hope for rain? Or do you start moving, knowing that the journey itself might kill the weakest members of your family? These are the choices elephants face when the land turns against them. And in 2019, matriarchs across Amboseli were being forced to make those choices every single day. Now I want you to picture this. Imagine walking through a landscape that used to be green, used to be full of life, and now it's just empty. The grass is gone. The bushes are brittle and dry. The ground cracks under your feet. That's what the Amboseli Basin looked like that year. And the elephants, they were struggling. Researchers on the ground reported seeing herds walking longer distances than ever before, sometimes covering 30 or 40 kilometers in a single day just searching for water. Calves were falling behind. Older elephants were collapsing from exhaustion. The mortality rate among young elephants spiked dramatically. It was a crisis. And the worst part? There was nothing anyone could do to stop it. You can't make it rain. You can't create water out of nothing. All you can do is watch and try to save the ones you can. This is where the Amboseli Trust for Elephants comes into the story. If you haven't heard of them, they're one of the most respected wildlife conservation organizations in Africa. They've been studying and protecting the elephants of Amboseli for over 50 years. They know these herds. They've documented family trees going back generations. They can identify individual elephants by sight, by the shape of their ears, the pattern of their tusks, the scars on their skin. When the drought hit, they were on the front lines. Their teams were out every day, monitoring herds, tracking movements, documenting which animals were struggling. And they were the ones who first received the call about a young calf found alone near the eastern border of the reserve. That call would change everything. Let me tell you something about elephant calves during droughts. They're the most vulnerable. They can't walk as far as adults. They can't go as long without water. They can't regulate their body temperature as efficiently. And they're completely dependent on their mothers, not just for protection, but for milk. An elephant calf nurses for the first 2 years of its life, sometimes longer. If it gets separated from its mother during a drought, its chances of survival drop to almost zero. The land is too harsh. The distances are too great. Without the herd, without the protection of the family, a calf alone in Amboseli during a drought is essentially a death sentence waiting to happen. That's the reality. That's what the conservation teams knew when they got the report about a lone calf near the eastern sector. Now, I need you to understand something about how elephant herds handle weakness. This isn't cruelty, it's survival. When a herd is on the move during a drought, they can't stop. If they stop, they die. The matriarch knows this. Every adult in the herd knows this. So when a calf gets stuck, when a calf falls behind, when a calf simply can't keep up anymore, the herd faces an impossible choice. Do they stay and risk everyone? Or do they keep moving? In most cases, herds will try to help. They'll use their trunks to lift a fallen calf. They'll slow their pace. They'll wait as long as they possibly can. But eventually, if the calf can't recover, they have to make the decision that no family should ever have to make. They have to leave someone behind. And that, according to the team's initial assessment, is exactly what happened here. The conservation team had been tracking a particular herd for weeks before the calf was found. They knew this family. They had records going back years. The matriarch was an older female they'd named Naomi, experienced, cautious, known for keeping her family together through previous hard seasons. When researchers found the lone calf, they checked the GPS data and realized Naomi's herd had passed through that exact area roughly 36 hours earlier. The tracks matched. The timeline matched. Everything pointed to one conclusion. This calf had been part of Naomi's family, and somehow, for some reason, he had been left behind. But why? What happened in those 36 hours that forced one of the most cohesive herds in the region to abandon one of their own? That's the question the team needed to answer. What they found when they examined the site told a story that I still think about. About 200 meters from where the calf was discovered, there was a dried-up mud pit, and around that pit, the ground was torn up, deep grooves in the earth, footprints overlapping footprints, drag marks leading in multiple directions. The team recognized the signs immediately. The calf had gotten stuck, probably walked into what looked like solid ground, but was actually a layer of dried mud over a deeper pocket of wet clay underneath. Once he was in, he couldn't get out on his own. The herd had tried to help him. You could see where they'd gathered around, where they'd used their trunks and their bodies to try to pull him free. But at some point, maybe after hours of trying, they couldn't do it anymore. And Naomi made the call. She led her family away. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I think it's easy to hear a story like this and think the herd abandoned him, that they gave up, that they didn't care enough. But that's not what happened. Every mark in that mud told a different story. A story of a family that tried everything. A story of a matriarch who probably stood there longer than she should have, knowing that every minute she waited put everyone else at risk. A story of a decision that had no right answer. The calf was eventually freed, whether by his own struggle or by the mud drying enough for him to climb out, the team wasn't sure. But by the time he got out, his family was gone, and he was alone in a landscape that had no mercy for the weak. That's when the conservation team found him. And that's when his second story began. And this is where our story really begins. It was early morning, just after 6, when a patrol unit from the Amboseli Trust spotted something unusual near a dried riverbed in the eastern sector of the reserve. At first, they thought it might be a rock formation or maybe a fallen tree. The light was still low, and the dust in the air made it hard to see clearly from a distance. But as they got closer, they realized what they were looking at. A young elephant calf standing completely still in the middle of an open plain. No herd in sight. No adults anywhere nearby. Just this small figure, alone, surrounded by nothing but cracked earth and silence. The patrol leader, a man named Joseph, who had worked with the trust for over 15 years, said later that his first thought was that the calf was already dead. He was that still, that motionless. It wasn't until they were within 50 meters that they saw his ears twitch. He was alive, barely. They approached slowly, carefully, not wanting to spook him. But honestly, they didn't need to worry about that. This calf wasn't going anywhere. As they got closer, Joseph could see the full extent of what they were dealing with. The calf's skin was covered in dried mud, thick, cracked layers of it caked onto his legs, his belly, his sides. His eyes were half closed, sunken, the way eyes look when a body has gone too long without water. His ribs were visible beneath his skin, each one casting a small shadow in the morning light. He was breathing, but each breath seemed to take effort, like even that simple act was almost too much for him. Joseph had seen sick elephants before. He had seen injured elephants, starving elephants, elephants at the edge of death. But something about this calf, the way he just stood there, not even trying to move, hit him differently. This wasn't just a sick animal. This was an animal that had given up. The team radioed back to base immediately. They described what they were seeing. A calf, approximately 8 to 10 months old based on his size, alone, severely dehydrated, showing signs of exhaustion and possible malnutrition. They requested backup and medical support. While they waited, they did what they could, which honestly wasn't much. You can't force an elephant to drink. You can't carry a 300-pound calf to safety on your own. All they could do was stay with him, keep him calm, and make sure no predators came near, because that was the other thing. A calf this weak, this exposed, was a target. Hyenas, lions, they would have picked up on his vulnerability eventually. The team knew they were working against the clock. Every hour that passed without intervention was an hour closer to an outcome nobody wanted to think about. While they waited for the rescue unit, Joseph walked the perimeter of the area. He was looking for clues, anything that might explain how this calf ended up here alone, and he found them. The signs were everywhere once you knew what to look for. Elephant tracks, dozens of them, heading northwest across the plain. Adult prints, juvenile prints, all moving in the same direction with purpose. A herd had passed through here recently. Very recently. The tracks were still sharp at the edges, not yet softened by wind or filled in by dust. Joseph estimated they were less than 2 days old, maybe even less. He followed them for about 100 meters before he found what he was looking for, a place where the tracks clustered together, overlapped, circled back on themselves. Something had happened here. The herd had stopped here for a reason. And then, just beyond that cluster, the tracks continued northwest. But one set of prints, smaller, lighter, didn't follow. They led back toward where the calf was standing now. Here's what the evidence suggested, and I want you to picture this as I describe it. The herd had been moving through this area, probably heading toward a water source they knew from previous droughts. At some point, they stopped. Maybe the calf fell behind. Maybe he collapsed and they tried to wait for him. But the cluster of tracks, that overlapping, circling pattern, that's what elephants do when they're conflicted, when they don't want to leave but know they have to. You could almost read the hesitation in those footprints. They had stood there, probably for hours, trying to decide. And then the tracks straightened out and continued northwest. All of them except one. The calf had tried to follow at some point. You could see where his prints started in the same direction. But after about 30 meters, they stopped, turned around, wandered in a small, aimless circle, and then nothing. He had given up trying to catch them. He had walked back to where they last stood together. And that's where he stayed. The rescue unit arrived about 2 hours after the initial call. They brought water, electrolyte solutions, a vehicle equipped for transport, and a veterinarian who specialized in elephant emergencies. Her name was Dr. Sarah Otieno, and she had been working with the trust for nearly a decade. The moment she saw the calf, she knew they were dealing with a critical case. His mucous membranes were pale, a sign of severe dehydration. His skin had lost elasticity, another bad sign. When she checked his heartbeat, it was weak and irregular. He was slipping away right in front of them. The first priority was getting fluids into him, but that's easier said than done with a frightened, weakened elephant calf. They couldn't just stick N4 in him like you would with a dog or a cat. They had to sedate him first, lightly, carefully, just enough to keep him calm without pushing his already stressed system over the edge. The sedation took effect within minutes. The calf's legs buckled slowly, and he sank to the ground in a controlled collapse. Dr. Otieno moved quickly, inserting N4 line and starting a slow drip of fluids and nutrients. The team worked around her, monitoring his breathing, keeping his airway clear, shading his body from the sun that was now climbing higher and hotter in the sky. For about an hour, nobody spoke much. They just worked. There was a tension in the air, that unspoken understanding that this could go either way. A calf this dehydrated, this weak, could crash at any moment. His heart could give out. His organs could start failing. Every minute that passed without a crisis was a small victory, but nobody celebrated. Not yet. They had seen too many rescues go wrong in the final stretch to allow themselves any optimism. By midday, the calf was stable enough to transport. They loaded him onto the vehicle using a specially designed sling, a process that required 6 people working in perfect coordination. He was unconscious throughout, which was probably a mercy. The drive back to the Trust's main facility took about 40 minutes, and Dr. Otieno rode in the back with him the entire way, monitoring his vitals, adjusting his fluids, talking to him softly even though he couldn't hear her. She told me later that she always talks to the animals she treats, even when they're sedated. She said it helps her stay focused. But I think there's more to it than that. I think, on some level, she was telling him to hold on, telling him that he wasn't alone anymore, that whatever had happened out there on that plane, he had a chance now, a chance that most calves in his situation never get. When they arrived at the facility, the calf was transferred to an intensive care enclosure, a shaded area with soft ground, constant monitoring, and round-the-clock staff. Over the next several hours, he received more fluids, antibiotics to prevent infection, and careful, measured doses of nutrients designed to restart his digestive system without overwhelming it. He remained unconscious for most of that first day, which concerned everyone. But by evening, something changed. His eyes opened. Not all the way, not with any real alertness, but they opened. He looked around, slowly, weakly, as if trying to understand where he was. One of the caretakers was sitting nearby, and she said later that when his eyes landed on her, he let out a small sound. Not a trumpet, not a call, just a soft, low rumble from deep in his chest. She didn't know what it meant, but she felt it. And she stayed with him all night. That first night was the hardest. The calf drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting to recover from what it had been through. The team took shifts watching him, checking his vitals every 30 minutes, adjusting his treatment as needed. By morning, he was still alive, which was more than anyone had dared to hope for when they first found him. His eyes were open more often now, tracking movement, showing the first signs of awareness returning. He still couldn't stand on his own, but he was trying. You could see the effort in his legs, the way they twitched and pushed against the ground even though they couldn't support his weight yet. He was fighting. Whatever had happened out there, the mud, the separation, the long hours alone, hadn't broken him completely. There was still something left. And over the next few days, that something would grow into something more, something the team wasn't expecting. But I'll get to that, because what happened next, the bond that formed, the recovery that followed, that's a whole other chapter of this story. Now, I want you to pay close attention here, because this part changed how I see elephant behavior. Once the calf was stable and the immediate crisis was under control, the research team did what they always do in cases like this. They went back to the site where he was found, and they conducted a full investigation. Not just a quick look around, a detailed, methodical examination of the area. They photographed everything. They measured tracks. They took soil samples. They mapped out every piece of evidence they could find within a half-kilometer radius. Because here's the thing about wildlife conservation that most people don't realize. Every rescue tells a story. And if you want to understand what really happened, if you want to learn something that might help the next animal in crisis, you have to read that story carefully. You have to look at the evidence without assumptions. And what they found at that site told a story that was far more complex than anyone initially thought. The first thing they documented was the mud pit, the one I mentioned earlier, about 200 meters from where the calf was found. In the dry season, these pits are death traps. What looks like solid ground is often just a thin crust of dried mud over a deeper layer of wet clay underneath. Animals walk across it thinking it's safe, and suddenly they break through. Their legs sink in, sometimes up to their bellies, and the clay acts almost like quicksand. The more they struggle, the deeper they sink. For a young calf, especially one already weakened by days of difficult travel, getting stuck in one of these pits is almost always fatal without intervention. The team examined this particular pit closely. They could see where the surface had been broken, where something had fallen through and thrashed around trying to get free. The edges of the hole were torn up, ragged, showing signs of a prolonged struggle. This wasn't a quick slip and recovery. Whatever happened here took time. But here's where the story gets more complicated and honestly more heartbreaking. Around that mud pit, the team found evidence that the herd hadn't just watched this happen from a distance. They had tried to help. There were deep gouges in the earth where adult elephants had clearly dug their tusks into the ground, trying to get leverage. There were drag marks, long, parallel lines in the dirt, suggesting that multiple elephants had wrapped their trunks around the calf and pulled. You could see where they had repositioned themselves, tried different angles, worked at this problem from multiple directions. The footprints around the pit were layered and overlapping, meaning they had been there for a while, hours, probably, maybe longer. This wasn't a herd that saw a calf in trouble and kept walking. This was a family that stopped everything and fought to save one of their own. And that changes the whole picture of what happened here. I spoke with Dr. Otieno about this, the veterinarian who treated the calf, and she explained something that I think everyone needs to understand. Elephant herds don't make decisions the way we do. They don't have meetings. They don't vote. But they do communicate constantly through a complex system of vocalizations, body language, and even infrasound low-frequency rumbles that humans can't hear, but elephants can detect from miles away. When a herd is facing a crisis like this, there's a kind of collective decision-making that happens. The matriarch plays a central role, but she's also reading the group. She's sensing their stress levels, their exhaustion, their fear. And at some point during that long struggle at the mud pit, something shifted. The group reached a threshold. The matriarch assessed the situation, the calf still stuck, the herd growing weaker, the distance still to travel, the water still to find, and she made a call. Not because she didn't care, because she cared about everyone. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. How could they just leave him? How could a mother, because yes, his mother was almost certainly there, walk away from her own calf? But I need you to understand the context. This was a drought, the worst in decades. Every hour that herd stayed in one place was an hour they weren't moving toward water. Every ounce of energy they spent trying to free the calf was energy they couldn't use to keep themselves alive. There were other calves in that herd. There were pregnant females. There were elderly elephants who were already struggling. The matriarch wasn't just thinking about one life. She was thinking about 15, maybe 20 lives. And she made the calculation, the terrible, impossible calculation, that staying any longer would cost more lives than it would save. That's not cruelty. That's leadership under impossible circumstances. That's the kind of decision no one should ever have to make, but someone did. The team also found something else that I think is worth mentioning. About 50 meters from the mud pit, in the direction the herd eventually traveled, there was a spot where the tracks paused again. Not for long, maybe a few minutes based on the impression depth, but long enough to be noticeable. And in that spot, there was a single set of smaller adult prints that broke away from the group and headed back toward the pit, then stopped, then turned around and rejoined the herd. Dr. Otieno believes this was the calf's mother. She thinks that even after the matriarch gave the signal to move, the mother hesitated. She went back or started to. Maybe she looked over her shoulder at her calf, still struggling in that pit. Maybe she heard him calling for her. And then she made her own impossible choice. She turned around and followed her family, because in the elephant world, a lone adult with a stuck calf has even less chance of survival than a herd that keeps moving. She couldn't save him alone, so she left. And I can't imagine what that walk felt like for her. Here's something else the investigation revealed that adds another layer to this story. Based on the GPS tracking data the trust had been collecting for months, they were able to confirm that this herd, Naomi's herd, had been under severe stress for weeks before this incident. They had traveled over 200 kilometers in the previous month, far more than their normal range. They had visited 3 different water sources, only to find each one dried up or too depleted to sustain them. Their movement patterns showed increasing desperation, longer daily distances, less time spent resting, more erratic route choices. By the time they reached the area where the calf got stuck, they were already running on empty. The matriarch wasn't making decisions from a place of comfort. She was managing a crisis that had been building for weeks. And the calf getting stuck, that was just the breaking point, the moment when a bad situation became an impossible one. I want to take a moment here to talk about something that I think gets overlooked in stories like this. We tend to anthropomorphize animal behavior. We assign human emotions and motivations to creatures that experience the world very differently than we do. But with elephants, that instinct isn't entirely wrong. Elephants do grieve. They do form deep emotional bonds. They do remember their dead and return to the bones of family members years later. Studies have shown that elephants exhibit signs of what we would call empathy. They comfort distressed herd members, they help injured companions, they even appear to mourn. So when I tell you that this herd tried to save that calf, I'm not projecting human feelings onto animals that don't have them. I'm describing behavior that researchers have documented over and over again. Elephants care about each other. They just live in a world where caring isn't always enough. The team's final report on the incident concluded that the calf had likely been stuck in the mud pit for somewhere between 6 and 10 hours before the herd moved on. That's a long time. That's a family standing in the brutal sun, using every ounce of strength they had, refusing to give up until they absolutely had to. And even after they left, the evidence suggests the calf didn't free himself immediately. He probably spent several more hours alone in that pit before the mud dried enough, or he found the right angle, or sheer desperation gave him one last burst of strength. By the time he got out, he was exhausted, dehydrated, and completely alone. He wandered. The tracks showed that, looking for his family, calling for them, probably hearing nothing in return. And then he just stopped. He stopped in the last place he remembered being with them. And he waited. That's where the patrol found him the next morning. Standing still, barely alive, waiting for a family that wasn't coming back. So that's what happened. That's the full picture, as best as the team could reconstruct it. A drought that pushed an entire ecosystem to its limits. A young calf who got stuck at the worst possible moment. A family that tried everything and still couldn't save him. A matriarch who made a decision that probably haunts her still, if elephants can be haunted, and I believe they can. And a mother who walked away from her child because she had no other choice. It's not a story with a villain. It's not a story where someone made a mistake that could have been avoided. It's just a story about survival and the terrible costs that survival sometimes demands. But here's the thing, this story isn't over, because that calf, against all odds, was still alive. And the people who found him were about to give him something he had lost out there in that empty plain. They were about to give him a second chance. And what happened during that second chance, the bonds that formed, the recovery that no one expected, that's where this story takes a turn that I honestly didn't see coming when I first started researching this case. They named him Kibo after Mount Kilimanjaro's highest peak. It was one of the caretakers who suggested it, a young woman named Grace who had been with the trust for just over 2 years. She said later that when she first saw him standing in that intensive care enclosure, weak and trembling but somehow still upright, she thought of the mountain, how it rises out of the plains, massive and enduring, visible from almost anywhere in Amboseli, how it's been there for millions of years, through droughts and floods and everything in between. She wanted to give him a name that meant something, a name that carried weight, a name that said, "You're going to survive this. You're going to stand tall again." And so Kibo it was. The team agreed without argument. It fit him somehow, even though he was just this small, fragile thing covered in dried mud and barely able to hold his head up. Sometimes you can see what something is going to become, even when it doesn't look like much yet. The first week was touch and go. I don't want to sugarcoat that part, because I think it's important to understand how close they came to losing him. Kibo's body had been through severe trauma, not just the dehydration and exhaustion, but the stress of separation, the hours of struggle in the mud, the long period of waiting alone without food or water or protection. His immune system was compromised. His digestive system had partially shut down. His muscles had started to atrophy from the combination of malnutrition and immobility. The veterinary team had to be incredibly careful with every aspect of his treatment. Too much food too fast could kill him. Too little could let him slip further away. They walked a tightrope for those first 7 days, adjusting his fluids constantly, monitoring his blood work twice daily, watching for any sign that his organs were failing. Every morning, they half expected to find that he hadn't made it through the night. But every morning, he was still there, still breathing, still fighting. By the end of the second week, something shifted. Kibo started eating on his own. Not much at first, just small amounts of a specialized milk formula designed to mimic elephant mother's milk. But he was taking it voluntarily, which was huge. Before that, the team had been feeding him through a tube, which is stressful for the animal and risky if done incorrectly. The fact that he was accepting food on his own meant his survival instincts were kicking back in. His body was starting to believe it might actually make it. Around the same time, he started standing for longer periods. At first, just a few minutes at a time before his legs would shake and he'd sink back down. But each day, the periods got a little longer. His muscles were rebuilding. His strength was returning. The team started allowing themselves cautious optimism, not celebration. Not yet, but the first real hope that this calf might actually pull through. The milk formula became Kibo's lifeline over the following weeks. Elephant calves in the wild nurse for up to 4 years, though they start eating solid food much earlier. For an orphan calf like Kibo, the formula had to provide everything, the nutrients, the antibodies, the calories his growing body needed. The trust had developed their formula over decades of trial and error, refining it based on what worked and what didn't. It contained a specific blend of fats, proteins, and vitamins designed to match the composition of natural elephant milk as closely as possible. Kibo received bottles every 3 hours around the clock, which meant someone was always with him, always feeding him, always monitoring him, always present. And this is where the story starts to shift from a medical recovery to something more. Because all those hours of constant contact, All those feedings and checkups and quiet moments in the enclosure, they created a bond that nobody planned for, but everyone could see. Grace was the one who noticed it first. She was part of the overnight rotation, responsible for the 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. feedings during her shifts. After a few weeks, she started noticing that Kibo reacted differently when she entered the enclosure compared to other caretakers. His ears would perk up. He would make this low rumbling sound, not distress, not hunger, just acknowledgement, like he recognized her specifically. She mentioned it to the other staff, and they started paying attention. Sure enough, while Kibo was cooperative with everyone, there was something different about his behavior with Grace. He would follow her around the enclosure when she cleaned it. He would lean against her when she sat down. He would reach his trunk toward her face, touching her gently, the way elephants touch the faces of family members they're bonded with. It was unmistakable. Out of everyone at the sanctuary, Kibo had chosen her. She was his person now. I talked to Grace about this, and what she told me was both beautiful and heartbreaking. She said that at first, she tried not to get too attached. Everyone at the trust knows the goal of rehabilitation is release. You're not supposed to become the animal's family, because eventually they need to go back to being wild. But Kibo made that impossible. He was so hungry for connection, so desperate for the comfort of another living being, that he attached to her with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. She told me about one night when she was sitting in the enclosure after a feeding, just resting for a few minutes before heading back to her quarters. Kibo walked over and lay down next to her, all 300 pounds of him, and put his head in her lap. Just rested it there. And he made this sound, this soft rumbling that she could feel vibrating through her legs. She sat there for almost an hour, not wanting to move, not wanting to break whatever was happening. That was the moment, she said, when she realized this wasn't just a job anymore. This was something else entirely. As the weeks turned into months, Kibo's personality started to emerge in ways that surprised everyone. He was curious, constantly investigating every corner of his enclosure, every new object, every visitor who came by. He was playful, especially with the large rubber balls and hanging ropes the team provided for enrichment. He would spend hours batting a ball around, chasing it, rolling it with his trunk, sometimes even trying to sit on it like he'd seen the staff sit on chairs. He was stubborn too. When he didn't want to do something, like take medication or move to a different area for cleaning, he would plant his feet and refuse to budge. It took patience and creativity to work with him on those days. But mostly, he was affectionate. He loved physical contact. He would press his body against the caretakers during feedings, would reach out to touch them whenever they were nearby, would make those soft rumbling sounds whenever someone spoke to him in a gentle voice. He was healing, not just physically but emotionally, and the staff was healing with him. By the 4th month, Kibo had gained almost 150 pounds. His ribs were no longer visible. His skin had regained its healthy gray color, the mud and dust of his ordeal long washed away. He was standing strong, walking confidently, even running short distances when he got excited about feeding time. The veterinary team declared him officially out of critical condition. He was no longer a calf fighting for survival. He was a young elephant thriving under care. The enclosure that had been his intensive care unit became his home, and the humans who staffed it became his family. He knew their schedules, their voices, their footsteps. He would get excited when certain staff members arrived for their shifts. He would sulk, and yes, elephants can absolutely sulk when Grace took days off. He had become, against all professional protocol, a beloved member of the Trust family, and everyone knew it couldn't last forever. But here's the thing about rescue stories that I think people don't always understand. The rescue is only half the battle. Actually, it's not even half. It's just the beginning. The real goal of wildlife rehabilitation isn't to save an animal's life and then keep it in captivity forever. The goal is to return that animal to the wild, to give it back the life it was supposed to have. For elephants especially, this is crucial. They're not meant to live in enclosures, even spacious, well-designed ones. They're meant to roam. They're meant to be part of herds, to travel across vast territories, to participate in the complex social structures that define elephant society. A life in captivity, no matter how comfortable, is not a full life for an elephant. And so, as Kibo grew stronger and healthier, the team knew they had to start thinking about the next phase. The phase that would be even harder than the rescue itself. Reintegration, returning Kibo to the wild. Returning him, if possible, to his family. The question hung over the sanctuary like a cloud that nobody wanted to look at directly. Could Kibo go back? Would his herd accept him after all this time? He had been separated from them for over 4 months now. In human terms, that might not seem like much, but for elephants, 4 months is significant. Calves learn constantly from their herds. Social behaviors, survival skills, communication patterns. Kibo had missed all of that. Instead, he had learned to trust humans, to associate their presence with food and safety and comfort. He smelled like the sanctuary now, like formula and enclosure bedding and human contact. Would Naomi's herd even recognize him? Would his mother? These were the questions the team debated in their meetings. The possibilities they weighed against each other late into the night. And they knew, even as they hoped for the best, that reintroduction was never guaranteed. Sometimes it works beautifully. Sometimes it doesn't work at all. And sometimes it breaks your heart in ways you didn't know were possible. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you what happened when they tried to bring Kibo home, I need to tell you about the preparation, the tracking, the moment when they finally found his herd again. Because what happened next is the part of this story that I still think about months after I first learned about it. Now here's where I need you to really pay attention, because what happens next, I didn't expect when I first read this report. Throughout Kibo's entire rehabilitation, the research team had never stopped tracking Naomi's herd. That's one of the things that makes the Umbaselli Trust so effective. They don't just rescue animals and hope for the best. They maintain detailed records, GPS data, movement patterns, everything you would need to understand where a herd has been and where it's likely going. For 4 months, while Kibo was learning to trust humans and regaining his strength, a separate team was monitoring his family from a distance. They watched as the herd continued its drought migration, moving slowly northward toward a region where underground springs still produced small amounts of water. They documented who was still with the group, who might have been lost along the way, how the herd's dynamics had shifted in the aftermath of leaving Kibo behind. And by the time Kibo was healthy enough to consider release, they knew exactly where his family was. About 40 kilometers north of the sanctuary, close enough to reach, close enough to try. The decision to attempt reintroduction wasn't made lightly. The team held multiple meetings, consulted with elephant behavior specialists from other organizations, reviewed case studies of previous reintroductions, both successful and unsuccessful. The odds, honestly, weren't great. Studies have shown that elephant calves separated from their herds for extended periods face significant challenges when attempting to rejoin. The longer the separation, the lower the success rate. 4 months was on the longer end of what had worked in documented cases. Some experts advised waiting, letting Kibo mature more, possibly introducing him to a group of other orphans first. Others argued that the window for reconnection with his birth family was closing, that every week that passed made it less likely they would accept him. In the end, the team decided to try. The drought had broken by then, the rains had finally come, the land was recovering, the herds were no longer in crisis mode. If there was ever going to be a good time to attempt this, it was now. They made the call. It was time to bring Kibo home. But what does home even mean to an elephant who's been gone for months? That's the question that kept the team up at night as they prepared for the reintroduction. Kibo had been just 8 months old when he was separated, old enough to have memories of his herd, but young enough that those memories might have faded or become confused. He had spent a third of his life now in the sanctuary, surrounded by humans, fed by bottles. sleeping in an enclosure instead of under open skies surrounded by the warm bodies of his family. His entire understanding of what was normal had shifted. The sounds he was used to hearing were human voices, vehicle engines, the clatter of feeding equipment. The smells he associated with safety were formula and hay and the particular scent of Grace's clothing. Would he even recognize the smell of wild elephants anymore? Would the vast open space of the savannah feel like freedom to him, or would it feel like the terrifying emptiness he experienced when he was abandoned? These weren't questions anyone could answer in advance. They would only find out by trying. The preparation took 2 weeks. First, they had to gradually adjust Kibo's routine to make the transition less jarring. They reduced the frequency of his feedings, spacing them out to mimic the less predictable access to nutrition he would have in the wild. They introduced him to new foods, grasses, leaves, bark that he would need to eat once he no longer had access to formula. They started taking him on walks outside the enclosure, letting him experience larger spaces, different terrains, the sounds and smells of the African bush. Grace was with him for most of these excursions, and she told me it was bittersweet watching him explore. He was so curious, so excited by everything new, but he also kept looking back at her, kept returning to her side, kept checking that she was still there. He wasn't afraid of the wild exactly. He was afraid of being alone in it again. And that fear, she knew, might be the thing that saved him or the thing that doomed the reintroduction entirely. The transport happened early on a Tuesday morning before the heat of the day set in. They loaded Kibo into a specially designed trailer, large enough for him to stand comfortably, padded to prevent injury, ventilated to keep him cool. Grace rode in the back of the support vehicle, close enough that Kibo could probably smell her presence even if he couldn't see her. The drive took just over 2 hours, following rough dirt roads that wound through the recovering landscape. The rains had transformed Amboseli in the weeks since they'd started. Brown plains had turned green. Dried riverbeds were flowing again. The whole ecosystem was coming back to life. It was beautiful, and it felt like a good omen. Like the land itself was ready to receive Kibo back. The team tried to stay optimistic, but there was tension in every vehicle. Everyone knew the statistics. Everyone knew how many ways this could go wrong. But they also knew that Kibo deserved the chance. He deserved to at least try to go home. They found Naomi's herd exactly where the tracking data said they would be, in a shallow valley near a cluster of acacia trees, grazing peacefully in the morning light. The team parked about half a kilometer away and set up observation equipment. Through binoculars, they could see the herd clearly. 15 elephants in total, adults, juveniles, a couple of young calves. Naomi was easy to spot, the largest female, positioned at the edge of the group where she could watch for threats. The team spent almost an hour just observing, documenting the herd's mood, their spacing, their behavior. They were looking for signs of stress or agitation, anything that might indicate this was a bad time to approach. But the herd seemed calm, relaxed even. The calves were playing, the adults were eating. There was none of the tight clustering or nervous movement that would suggest they felt threatened. The team lead made the call. It was time. The plan was simple but carefully thought out. They would release Kibo from the trailer at a distance of about 300 meters from the herd, close enough that they would notice him, far enough that they wouldn't feel immediately threatened. Then they would wait. They wouldn't force anything, wouldn't try to guide Kibo toward the herd or push the herd toward him. Elephant social dynamics are too complex and too sensitive for human interference. Either the connection would happen naturally, or it wouldn't happen at all. The team positioned their vehicles in a wide arc, ready to intervene only if Kibo was in physical danger. Grace stood near the trailer door, her hand on Kibo's flank, feeling him tremble slightly. She told me later that she whispered to him before she opened the door. She doesn't remember exactly what she said. Something about being brave, something about how she would always be proud of him. And then she stepped back, and the door swung open. Kibo didn't move at first. He stood in the doorway of the trailer, his trunk raised, testing the air. The team watched through their binoculars, barely breathing. You could see the moment he caught the scent of the herd, his whole body went still. His ears spread wide. His trunk stretched forward like he was trying to grab the smell and pull it closer. For almost a full minute, he just stood there, processing. And then, slowly, he stepped out of the trailer. 1 foot, then another, then all four on the ground. He was free. He was standing in the open savanna for the first time in 4 months. And about 300 meters away, the herd had noticed him. Several heads turned in his direction. The grazing stopped. Even from that distance, the team could see the herd's attention shift, could see them assessing this new presence on the edge of their territory. Naomi raised her trunk, sampling the wind. The moment of truth was approaching. Kibo started walking toward them. Not running, not charging, just walking, slowly, hesitantly. Every few steps he would stop and raise his trunk again, as if confirming that yes, those shapes in the distance were real, that yes, he was really doing this. The team tracked his progress through their scopes, calling out distances: 250 meters, 200, 150. At about 100 meters, something changed in the herd's behavior. They stopped what they were doing completely. Every elephant was now facing Kibo, watching his approach. A few of the younger ones took steps toward him, curious. But Naomi held her position, and the rest of the adults stayed back with her. They were waiting to see what she would do. In elephant society, the matriarch's reaction sets the tone for everyone else. If she welcomed this stranger, they would welcome him. If she rejected him, they would reject him. Everything depended on what happened in the next few minutes. At 50 meters, Kibo stopped. The team could see him trembling now, not from cold, not from weakness, but from something else entirely. Anticipation, maybe, or fear, or some combination of emotions that humans don't have words for, but elephants feel deeply. He stood there, trunk raised, ears forward, making soft rumbling sounds that the microphones barely picked up. And then, from the herd, a single elephant began walking toward him. Not Naomi, a younger female, maybe 5 or 6 years old. She approached cautiously, her own trunk extended. When she got within 10 meters, she stopped. The two elephants stood facing each other, trunks reaching but not quite touching. The team held their breath. This was it. This was the moment when everything would be decided. And watching through my screen when I reviewed the footage months later, knowing what was about to happen, I still felt my heart pounding. Because what happened next, the way this first contact unfolded, that's when this story stopped being about hope and started being about something much more complicated. And this is the moment that broke me. The young female who had approached Kibo stood there for what felt like an eternity, her trunk extended toward his, almost touching but not quite. The team watched through their binoculars, nobody speaking, nobody even moving. There was something happening between those two elephants, some kind of assessment, some kind of communication that humans can only observe but never fully understand. And then, just as it seemed like contact might be made, the young female pulled back. She didn't run. She didn't show fear. She just withdrew her trunk, stood still for a moment, and then turned and walked back toward the herd. Kibo took a step forward, as if to follow her, but stopped when he saw that she wasn't looking back. The team's hearts sank. That wasn't the reaction they had hoped for, but it wasn't the worst outcome either. Sometimes these things take time. Sometimes the first contact is just the beginning of a longer process. They still had hope. They didn't know yet that hope was about to be crushed completely. The young female's retreat seemed to trigger something in the herd. There was movement now, a shifting of positions, elephants repositioning themselves in ways that the team recognized as defensive clustering. The calves were being moved toward the center of the group. The adults were forming a loose perimeter. And Naomi, the matriarch, the one whose decision mattered more than anyone else's, was finally moving. She had been watching from the back of the herd, letting the younger female make first contact, assessing the situation from a distance. But now she stepped forward, pushing through the group with the slow, Deliberate movement of an elephant who knows her authority is absolute. The other elephants parted for her, making way, their eyes following her as she walked toward the front of the herd, toward Kibo. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. The team leader whispered into his radio, "Nobody move, nobody speak, let this happen." And everyone obeyed, frozen in place, watching history unfold. Naomi approached Kibo slowly. There was no aggression in her body language, no threat display, just careful assessment. She was doing what matriarchs do, evaluating a potential member of the herd, deciding whether this individual belonged or didn't. Kibo stood absolutely still as she approached, his whole body tense, his trunk hanging limply at his side as if he'd forgotten how to use it. When Naomi got within 5 meters, she stopped. She extended her trunk toward him, that long, powerful, incredibly sensitive organ that elephants use to smell and touch and communicate. She reached toward his face, toward his mouth, toward the spots where elephants carry their most personal scent signatures. The team watched through their scopes as her trunk made contact with his skin. She was smelling him, reading him, trying to find something in his scent that matched her memories. And for one perfect, terrible moment, everyone watching thought the same thing. This is it. She recognizes him. He's going home. The moment stretched. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Naomi's trunk moved across Kibo's face, around his ears, down his neck. She was being thorough, the way elephants always are when they're trying to identify someone. Kibo leaned into her touch slightly, the way a calf leans into its mother, seeking comfort and connection. He made a sound, a soft, trembling rumble that the directional microphones picked up clearly. It sounded almost like a question, like he was asking, "Do you know me? Do you remember?" The team held their collective breath. Some of them later admitted they had tears in their eyes already, expecting a reunion, expecting the kind of beautiful moment that makes this work worthwhile. Grace, watching from the support vehicle, had her hand pressed against her mouth, unable to look away. And then Naomi did something that nobody expected. She pulled her trunk back sharply. She took a step backward. And she made a sound, a short, harsh vocalization that the team had heard before in other contexts. A sound that meant, "No, not one of us. Stay away." The effect on the herd was immediate. At Naomi's signal, the entire group began moving. Not scattered, not panicked. Organized, coordinated. The adults guided the younger elephants away from Kibo, forming a protective barrier as the herd started walking in the opposite direction. It happened so fast that the team almost couldn't process what they were seeing. One moment, there had been the possibility of reunion. The next moment, there was just a herd retreating and a single calf standing alone in the grass, watching them go. Kibo didn't move at first. He just stood there, his body frozen in the position it had been in when Naomi touched him, as if he couldn't quite understand what had just happened. And then, as the herd got farther away, he did something that broke every single person watching. He called out, a loud, desperate trumpet that echoed across the valley. A sound that meant, "Wait, please wait. Don't leave me again." The herd didn't stop. They didn't slow down. They didn't even look back. Naomi led them steadily away, maintaining a pace that Kibo could have matched if he'd tried to follow, but making it absolutely clear through her body language and vocalizations that following was not welcome. Kibo called out again, louder this time, more desperate, and again, and again. The team counted 7 distinct vocalizations in the first 2 minutes, each one more anguished than the last. He started walking toward them, his pace quickening, his trunk raised as if reaching for something he couldn't touch. But every time he got closer, the herd adjusted, moving faster, keeping the distance between them constant. They weren't running from him exactly. They were just refusing to let him catch up, refusing to let him close the gap. It was like watching someone try to hug a family that kept stepping backward every time they reached out. The cruelty wasn't in the violence. It was in the deliberate, sustained rejection. The message was clear. You are not welcome here anymore. The team made the difficult decision to let it play out. They didn't intervene, didn't try to stop Kibo from following, didn't try to redirect him back toward the trailer. The protocol for reintroduction attempts is clear. You give the animals space to figure it out themselves, because human interference often makes things worse. So they watched. For almost an hour, they watched as Kibo followed his former family across the valley, keeping pace but never gaining ground. They watched as his calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. They watched as his walk slowed from determined pursuit to confused wandering. And they watched as he finally stopped moving entirely, standing in the middle of an open plain, staring at the distant shapes of elephants who used to be his family. The herd was almost a kilometer away by then, close enough to see, too far to reach. And Kibo just stood there, not calling anymore, not trying to follow, just standing, alone, the same way he had been standing when the patrol first found him 4 months ago. Like everything they had done, all the healing and bonding and hope, like none of it had made any difference at all. I talked to Dr. Otieno about this, the same veterinarian who had treated Kibo when he first arrived at the sanctuary, and what she told me helped me understand what had happened, even if it didn't make it hurt any less. She explained that elephant recognition isn't just about visual identification. Elephants actually have relatively poor eyesight compared to their other senses. What they rely on most is smell and sound, the unique scent signature that every elephant carries, and the specific vocal patterns that distinguish one individual from another. When Kibo was separated from his herd, he was 8 months old. He had a particular smell, a combination of his mother's milk, the herd's collective scent, the environment they lived in. After 4 months in the sanctuary, all of that had changed. He smelled like formula now, like human contact, like the specific plants and soils of the sanctuary grounds. To Naomi's trunk, he might as well have been a completely different elephant. The calf she remembered, the one she had tried to save from that mud pit, that calf no longer existed in any way she could recognize. But it wasn't just the smell. Dr. Otieno explained that elephant social bonds are maintained through constant interaction, touch, sound, shared experiences. When a calf is separated from its herd, those bonds start to weaken immediately. The herd doesn't forget, exactly, but they adjust. They reform their social structures around the absence. Other elephants take on new roles, new relationships form, the dynamic shifts to accommodate the loss. After 4 months, Naomi's herd had already adapted to Kibo's absence. He wasn't a missing member anymore. He was a stranger. And elephants, despite their reputation for compassion and loyalty, can be deeply suspicious of strangers. A foreign elephant approaching a herd could be a threat, could carry disease, could disrupt the carefully balanced social order that keeps everyone safe. Naomi's rejection wasn't personal in the human sense. It was practical. She was protecting her family from an unknown variable. The fact that the unknown variable was once her own grandson, if elephants even think in those terms, didn't change the calculation. He was different now. And different meant dangerous. The team tried twice more over the following days. Each attempt followed the same pattern. They would position Kibo within sight of the herd, give him the opportunity to approach, and watch as the same rejection played out. The second time, Naomi didn't even approach him herself. She sent warning signals from a distance, aggressive postures and vocalizations that made it clear he wasn't welcome. The third time, one of the adult females actually charged at Kibo, stopping short but close enough to make him stumble backward in fear. After that charge, the team made the call to stop trying. They had hoped that repeated exposure might help, that the herd might gradually accept him if given enough chances. But the opposite was happening. Each encounter was making the rejection more emphatic, more aggressive. They were traumatizing Kibo without any benefit. Grace was the one who finally said it out loud, what everyone was thinking but nobody wanted to admit. He's not going back. They don't want him anymore. We have to accept that and figure out what comes next. And as much as it hurt to hear those words, the team knew she was right. This chapter of Kibo's story was over. The family he had been born into, the family he had spent 4 months dreaming of returning to, they had closed the door, and no amount of hoping or trying was going to open it again. Kibo never went back to his original herd. I want to be clear about that because I think it's important to sit with the reality of this story before we get to what comes next. The team made 3 attempts at reintroduction, and all 3 failed. After the 3rd attempt, the one where an adult female charged at him, they made the decision to stop trying. It wasn't an easy decision. Nobody wanted to give up. But there's a difference between persistence and cruelty, and continuing to put Kibo through that trauma would have crossed that line. So they brought him back to the sanctuary, back to the enclosure where he had spent 4 months healing, back to the humans who had become his substitute family. Grace was waiting for him when the trailer arrived. She told me later that when Kibo saw her, he made that low rumbling sound he always made when she was around. But it was different this time, quieter, sadder, like he knew something had changed, like he understood, in whatever way elephants understand these things, that the door to his old life had closed forever. The weeks following the failed reintroduction were difficult. Kibo wasn't the same elephant he had been before. The curious, playful calf who had charmed everyone at the sanctuary seemed to have retreated somewhere inside himself. He ate when food was offered, but without enthusiasm. He accepted affection from the caretakers, but didn't seek it out the way he used to. He spent long hours standing at the edge of his enclosure, facing north, the direction his herd had gone, as if waiting for something that wasn't coming. The veterinary team monitored him closely, worried about depression, worried about failure to thrive, worried about all the ways that emotional trauma can manifest in physical decline. Elephants are deeply emotional creatures. They grieve. They mourn. They can die from broken hearts in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to deny. Everyone at the sanctuary knew that saving Kibo's life wasn't enough if they couldn't find a way to save his spirit too. The decision to introduce Kibo to other orphaned elephants wasn't made immediately. There were concerns about how he would react, whether he was emotionally ready for new social bonds after being rejected by his own family. But after consulting with behavioral specialists and reviewing cases from other sanctuaries across Africa, the team decided it was worth trying. Isolation wasn't helping him. Human companionship, as much as he valued it, couldn't replace what he had lost. Elephants need other elephants. They need the physical contact, the social interaction, the complex communication that only happens between members of their own species. So they began the process of introducing Kibo to the sanctuary's small group of orphaned calves, 3 other young elephants who had each lost their families to various tragedies and were now living together under the trust's care. It was a careful process, gradual and supervised, with plenty of space for retreat if things went wrong. Nobody knew if it would work, but everyone hoped. The first introduction was to a female calf named Zuri, about 6 months younger than Kibo. She had been rescued from a similar situation, found alone after herd was scattered by poachers, too young to survive on her own. Zuri was smaller than Kibo, shyer, more hesitant around new experiences. The team thought her gentle temperament might make her a good first contact, less likely to overwhelm Kibo or trigger memories of the aggressive rejection he had experienced. They brought the 2 calves to a neutral area, a large open enclosure where neither had established territory, and let them see each other from a distance. For almost 20 minutes, nothing happened. They just stood on opposite sides of the space, watching each other, neither willing to make the first move. The staff began to worry that this was going to be another failure, another rejection, another blow to an elephant who had already experienced too many. And then something shifted. Zuri took a step forward, then another. She moved slowly, cautiously, her trunk raised to sample Kibo's scent from a distance. Kibo watched her approach without retreating, without showing fear, without any of the tension that had marked his encounters with his birth herd. When Zuri got within a few meters, she stopped and extended her trunk toward him, the same gesture that Naomi had made before rejecting him, but somehow different. softer, more curious than judgmental. And Kibo, instead of freezing or pulling back, did something that made Grace burst into tears where she was watching from behind the fence. He extended his trunk too. He reached toward Zuri the same way he had once reached toward his mother, toward his grandmother, toward the family that no longer wanted him. And when their trunks touched, when that first moment of contact happened between these two orphan calves, something changed in Kibo's posture. His ears relaxed. His body softened. He made a sound that nobody had heard from him in weeks. A sound that wasn't grief or confusion or despair. A sound that might, if you were willing to believe in such things, have been hope. The bond between Kibo and Zuri developed faster than anyone expected. Within days, they were inseparable, eating together, sleeping near each other, engaging in the kind of play behavior that the staff had almost forgotten Kibo was capable of. He would chase her around the enclosure, trumpeting with a joy that seemed almost aggressive in its intensity, like he was making up for lost time. She would lean against him when she was tired, tucking herself under his larger body the way calves tuck under their mothers for protection. They developed their own communication patterns, their own routines, their own private language of rumbles and touches that the caretakers could observe but never fully translate. The transformation in Kibo was remarkable. The withdrawn, grieving calf who had stood at the fence staring north was gone. In his place was an elephant who had found a reason to engage with life again. Not the life he was supposed to have, not the family he was born into, but something real, something his, something that belonged to him in a way that his birth family never would again. Over the following months, Kibo was introduced to the other orphans in the group, a young male named Taji and another female named Amara. Each introduction followed the same careful protocol, and each one added another thread to the social fabric that was forming around Kibo. He wasn't the oldest in the group, but he became something like the leader, the one who approached new situations first, the one who stood between the others and anything that seemed threatening. The one who seemed to take responsibility for the well-being of his new family in a way that the staff found both touching and a little heartbreaking. Because here was an elephant who had been abandoned by his own herd, rejected by his own blood, left behind when he needed them most, and his response to that trauma wasn't to become withdrawn or aggressive. His response was to become protective, to make sure that no one in his new family would ever feel as alone as he had felt standing in that field, watching his birth herd walk away. I got an update on Kibo about 3 weeks before I started writing this story. He's still at the sanctuary, still living with Zuri, Taji, and Amara. He's almost 2 years old now, not a calf anymore by elephant standards, but not quite an adult either. The plan, eventually, is to release the whole group together into a protected area of the reserve where they can live wild but monitored, forming their own small herd that might one day grow and merge with others. It's not the life Kibo would have had if things had gone differently. He'll never migrate the paths his ancestors walked. He'll never learn from Naomi's decades of wisdom. He'll never know his mother as anything other than a fading memory of warmth and milk and safety. But he'll have something that matters just as much, maybe more. He'll have a family that chose him. A family that formed not from blood but from shared experience, shared trauma, shared survival. A family that looked at him and said, "Yes, you belong with us. You're one of ours now." Here's what I want you to take from this story. If you take anything at all, family isn't always blood. Home isn't always where you started. Sometimes the people who were supposed to love you can't, for reasons that have nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with circumstances beyond anyone's control. And sometimes the family you lose leads you to the family you were meant to find. I'm not saying what happened to Kibo was good. I'm not saying there's some cosmic plan that makes abandonment and rejection acceptable, because it leads to something better eventually. What happened to him was painful. The choices that were made, by the drought, by the herd, by nature itself, left scars that will never fully heal. But Kibo is alive. Kibo is loved. Kibo has found belonging in a world that tried to take it away from him. And if that's not a story worth telling, I don't know what is. If this story moved you, leave a comment. I mean that I read every single one, and the conversations that happen in the comments section are one of my favorite parts of doing this channel. Tell me what you think about Kibo's journey. Tell me if you've ever experienced something similar, finding family in unexpected places, building connections after loss. Tell me what you want to hear more of in future videos. And if you're new here, if this is the first story of ours you've watched, I hope it won't be the last. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. We tell real wildlife stories on this channel. Not the simple ones, not the ones with easy answers, but the ones that stay with you after the video ends. The ones that make you think differently about the creatures we share this planet with. Kibo's story is one of hundreds I've researched over the years, and I promise you, there are more coming that will hit just as hard. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And I'll see you in the next one.